Welcome to Hey Chaplain. My name is Jared Altick, and I'm a chaplain with the police department. This podcast exists so the cops can hear something positive and encouraging. There is so much experience and wisdom that does not naturally filter its way down to every patrolman, and I want to fix that. On this podcast, you'll hear from detectives and dispatchers, U.S. Marshals and county sheriffs, and the occasional crime scene investigator from my hometown of Kansas City. From the LAPD to Scotland Yard, the guests on Hey Chaplain give you their hard-earned wisdom so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Today we continue our conversation with Dr. Cordell Hachinsky. If you didn't catch part 1, go back right now and listen to that episode. In this episode, we're going to continue this discussion on failure, but we're also going to talk about his career change from combat leader to medical doctor. I hope you listen to this carefully because Dr. Hachinsky is a Christian man and he's going to talk about hearing God call him to a new career. But I want you to listen to him describe the process of coming to that conclusion and the different ways that making a big career decision affected him. I think it's really valuable to hear an intelligent and thoughtful man describe a transition that was really difficult for him. It's the main reason I wanted the good doctor to talk to you. Here's U.S. Army Major Cordell Hachinsky, MD.
So, kind of a unique part of my story is that after 7 years in the armor, I really felt God's direction pushing me completely differently. And so after coming back from Afghanistan, I felt God's pull to medicine, which when I told some people that I worked there, they made the very kind of ironic comments that you're not a healer, you're a killer. So, I mean, it really much was like the opposite side of the coin. I went from somebody who was designed to take other people's lives when necessary, and into the defense of others, to I save lives at all costs, almost.
Yeah.
So, I mean, a complete mentality shift. But, you know, I think that transition of mindsets wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. I think that God had been setting that up for a long time, that mentality was starting to change, long before the actual physical change.
Now, your degree at West Point was presumably in engineering.
Yeah, so I was a mechanical engineer at West Point, then went into the armor, and then went into medicine, which of course makes zero sense for anything. So it just sounds like I'm completely uncommittal or can't decide what I want to do with my life, which may be true. So when I tell my wife I want to be a taxi driver when I grow up, she just kind of laughs at me and says, "Oh man, not another career change." I think that the next area that I failed was very personal. So I came back from Afghanistan and told my wife 2 things. I think God's calling me to medicine, and I think we should start a family. And she went, "Go back to Afghanistan." She goes, I can't handle all of that. That was way too much all at one moment. She's like, "I haven't seen you in a year. You need to go back." She was joking, but so that big life transition there. So as I was starting to send in applications and do research and prepare for the MCAT, which is the test and all that kind of stuff, that's when she started to notice, and I started to notice in myself that change. When I had come back from Afghanistan, I knew very much in my heart that God was calling me into medicine. But then my pride got involved, and I started getting consumed with this idea of, wow, I could be a doctor. I might make this money. I might have this prestige. Look at what I can do. And that was absolutely just devastating to my relationships with the people around me because I started getting prideful and started looking. And so that pursuit of becoming a doctor, even though that I know that God was calling me to do that, I actually gave it up because of what it was making me become.
You've told me this story before, but can you tell me the story about your wife, Whitney's uncle, and him inviting you into surgery, and about where is this in the timeline of you pursuing med school?
About 3 months just into this process where I hadn't done anything permanent, hadn't taken the tests, hadn't done any applications. That's when I kind of just gave it up and went and just said, you know what, we're going to stay with the Army. And so made many plans to kind of continue the career with the Army. And that's when her uncle invited me to come spend a day in the operating room with him. And I told him, I was like, I'm sorry, that's not something that I'm pursuing any longer. And that was when Whitney said, I think you should. And I said, why? I mean, like that, this was not. And she said, well, somehow in giving up what you have pursued in medicine, you become the type of person that should pursue medicine. And I don't know that I recognize that in myself, but I very much appreciated that someone had noticed that I'd at least had been humbled. So I failed in my pride, that even though that I knew in my heart that God had called that, I had failed him in that way, at least in my mind.
You made it all about yourself.
I made it about me.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so anyway, I went and I spent that day in the OR with him, and then I came back and Whitney asked me, she goes, so what did you think? And I still remember where we were sitting in the car, and this is super cliche, but I looked at her and I said, that was awesome. And then that was the day that I really started pursuing that. And, you know, God set out all of the right road marks. When I went to, we had a dog that we had just adopted at the time who needed surgery. Anyway, the only place that would accept the dog to do surgery, which is Ivan, our dog now, was the University of Florida. And so we drove down to the University of Florida, and while we were on our way down, Whitney was like, why don't you just go over to the medical school and see what it's like? And I walked over and, I called and they were like, we will get you in to see you today. And I was like, what? I was just going to ask about some information about they're like, oh, why don't you just come over and talk to us? And I walked in and, just everything, God just laid out everything. The people there were wonderful. They were just so affirming of that pursuit. And by no means were they saying that I was into medical school, but it was just so affirming that I knew that God was blessing that path yet again. And so I went after the surgery. We went back and I continued to do my Army job. And at the same time, I started doing night classes at a local college to get some of the prerequisite courses that I needed in order to apply for medical school. And so Whitney remembers this is a very strenuous time because we were studying for MCATs and going to night classes. And also I was a company commander at the time. And so doing all of that at the same time in the pursuit of this, it really took, I still have a list of about 75 things that God had to open the door to do. And he opened up all of the doors.
So counting 4 years of West Point, you had how many years total in the Army?
Yeah, 11 at the time that I switched over into medicine.
Okay. So how do you go from the very regimented, very structured world of the United States Army to a college campus in Florida?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially as an old guy, which I was at the time.
Yeah, you were pushing 30-ish, right? Late 20s?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, and we had just had our first son, and our daughter was born within the first few months of medical school. So, I was the old guy who was married with 2 kids, who had had a life and a career beforehand. That was quite different than the norm of most students.
Sure, that puts you in a minority. Were in your medical school, were there other older students?
There were.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay. So you weren't the only one, but you were in a definite minority. You were not the typical medical student.
There may have been 2 other people that had children.
Okay.
A dozen or 2 dozen that were married. Maybe a dozen that had a career beforehand. But for the vast majority of people that go into medical school, they're coming out of undergrad, and then they're going into medical school. And so
they're 22 years old and unattached and
right.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And living a completely different lifestyle
yes.
in a lot of different ways. So, I mean, there's an absolute transition there. And I think that's, you bring something with you. And so even though it may feel like you are completely leaving behind an old life and going into a new, you don't. That life comes with you.
Okay.
For good and for bad.
Okay.
There are aspects of that old life that you are going to bring in that are going to set you apart and make it just the way that you conduct this new life just so uniquely and so awesomely from what I've seen from other people. And in the other ways, sometimes you bring some baggage with you. You've seen some things. You've dealt with some things that others won't have dealt with and will have no ability to relate.
Some people going into med school were told 4 years, 5 years, 6 years previous by a school counselor that, guidance counselor said, you should consider becoming a doctor. You should consider medical school. That's not your path. You did West Point. You got a degree in engineering. You were a cavalry officer in Afghanistan in a combat zone. How do you go from there to medical school? What would lead to that big of a change in your life? That's a pretty big course correction there. That's huge.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it felt like an act of obedience that I felt called.
Okay, so you're gonna have to explain that. Yeah. What do you mean you felt called? Yeah.
So again, this is where it gets a little bit to that the softy, feely, touchy stuff that you're like, so did you actually hear a physical voice inside your head? And you're like, no, not exactly. But did you feel it in your heart? Yeah. And I think that's, and again, when in the few times in my life that I've actually been able to calm or quiet my mind enough to actually let God have his say, you don't hear it as a blight. I don't get bright flashing lights.
Right.
I get very subtle, small messages.
Yeah.
But in your heart that is what it is.
It's convincing, even if it's not audible.
Yeah, absolutely. It leaves an effect on you that when you're thinking through this, you are being asked to do this. And it's not, at least for me, it's not this violent act of like, you will do this or else. It's that God over time slowly realigned me, and he realigned my interests and my passions and my experiences into something different.
Okay, so describe what those were. What were the milestones along this path where God spoke to you and said, hey, I really think you need to be doing a different kind of career?
Yeah. The first one that I didn't realize this at the time. So when we were in Afghanistan, we had a embedded reporter that was with us, and he was doing a story on what we were doing. And I remember one day we were sitting on our little cots that we were sleeping in at night, and he asked me, he said, how do you think we win a counterinsurgency fight? And I remember telling him, I said, I don't think we do it by killing more people. I think we do it by changing their minds about like what we are doing. And he goes, that's a pretty unique viewpoint. He's like, most of the soldiers around here just don't feel that way. They're here to do a mission. They're here to get rid of the Taliban.
Yeah, kill the bad guy.
Yeah, kill the bad guy, which is absolutely a part of the mission that we have. He goes, do you think that's the way of the future in the Army? And I don't even remember how I answered. I think I probably said something to like, I have no idea. I'm a second lieutenant in Afghanistan. I don't really know much of anything about this point. But that question stuck with me, that was part of it. That was just evidence that God had been rerouting the way that my mind was thinking towards just purely being a man of violence, towards something else. And I didn't know what that something else was at the time. But a few months later, we were on patrol, and we had gotten into a firefight with the Taliban. And after that firefight had concluded, a local farmer had got caught in between our fires and had got shot through the leg. And so the Taliban had ran off. And so we, as soldiers, went up and started providing care to him. And as I was coordinating kind of the security around that, I felt this idea that I was going to be the one providing the care, not providing the security for the care. And I said, that's a weird thought. And I kind of like tucked it under something and never touched it for a while. And then a few months later on in the mission, after we had kind of pushed the Taliban back enough that we could start doing more humanitarian things, we were trying to set up a free healthcare center in southern Afghanistan, which to my knowledge had never been done previously. And I was put in charge of coordinating the security for that and kind of coordinating with the doctors and the pharmacists and medics to provide that health care. And on the day that it actually occurred, I was walking around and again felt that same still small voice saying, I want you behind the curtains, not providing the security on the outside. And I kind of mulled that over, and then you put that, so that we had a physician's assistant who was assigned to our unit, and he came down maybe a month later and ended up getting stuck at our little base that we had because the firefighting was so heavy around it that we couldn't get him out anymore. We couldn't get helicopters in, we couldn't get vehicles out. So he got stuck. And so he ended up sleeping next to me for several days. And so we talked and chatted about medicine because that had been something that had been kind of there. So I think those 4 events really played into the point where when I got home from Afghanistan, I told Whitney, I think God is calling us to go to medical school, and I think he's calling us to start a family, which I kind of previously referenced.
Yeah.
So that was the act of obedience for me. But then that also led into, my pride getting in the way, which we referred to previously.
So you start med school, but you're still in the Army. You didn't leave the Army. So what does that look like to have one foot in both worlds?
So I kind of did leave the Army. So I resigned my commission for 15 minutes and then re-upped my commission.
Okay.
But the way that I did it going into a civilian world, I had to give up that. So I went from being a captain back to being a second lieutenant again.
I don't think I knew that.
So that was a really fun experience. So for the next 4 years, I was a second lieutenant. And so only like for a month at a time each year would I have to go be on active duty. But it was really fun walking around as a second lieutenant again and everybody just looking at you like you shouldn't know anything and being completely okay with them thinking that I didn't know anything.
Right.
So,
in reality, you've already led a company and yeah.
But there's some peace in people just thinking that you don't know anything. And so that was really nice to be able to just, to act ignorant. Right. So,
yeah.
But yeah, so I went back, and then when you graduate from medical school, you are put back in a captain's rank. I think that's where the next failure for me happened, and I think this one is a life-shaping failure for me that I'd like to share this story. While we were in medical school, my daughter, who's now Esther, the 30th of September, I still remember this day very well. Whitney woke up that morning and just was not acting herself. This was about 4:00 in the morning. She was acting really weird. She's pregnant. She's pregnant with Esther.
Okay.
She's in her eighth month. And she's just not acting herself. She had like a little cough and a little fever the night before. It wasn't really that big of a deal. But again, this is about the 4th month of medical school. And we're sitting in our apartment in Florida, and she starts to not be able to walk well. She's like, can't really move around. And then she starts bleeding. And this was about 5:00 in the morning. And so at that point I was like, oh man, we're going to the hospital right now. And in a way that only God provides, her mom had decided, you know what? I can't sleep. I'm going to drive up to Gainesville this morning and be there. And she was pulling into the parking lot as I was running. I was carrying Whitney down the stairs to go to the car. And so she was there to stay with our other son who was there. And so God provided that. So I took Whitney straight to the emergency room. They took her straight up to the OB floor. They took her back and could not find a heartbeat for Esther. And so they did a emergency C-section, and within about 5 minutes of us getting to that OB floor, Esther was born. But she was born not breathing. It took them 30 minutes to an hour to get her to start breathing. She was in the NICU for the next month, and Whitney was just we don't really know what happened, but she just lost herself for about a week. She was hallucinating. She didn't know who she was. She didn't know what had happened. She didn't know that she had a baby. She was gone. And and during that emergency C-section, they had nicked something, and so she couldn't walk. And so it took us 3 or 4 months to get Whitney back to the point where she could really function again. She couldn't walk. She was barely able to register that she had a child in the intensive care unit. It was a really, really traumatic time. Well, I, in my own pride, interpreted that as I should go into OBGYN, into obstetrics and gynecology as a field of medicine. And had convinced myself enough to do that I went through all of the processes and ignored some pretty blatant signs that God was like, that's not where I want you to go. But because of those experiences, I had interpreted the experiences that he had given me as, this is what I'm supposed to do because I have this, and God would never give me this unless it was for something good. And how I interpreted that was that it had to be me going into OBGYN. Well, when it came to actually matching, so after residency, you get matched into a field. It's kind of like a draft, kind of like the NFL draft in a lot of ways. That
you don't always get what you want as your first pick.
You don't always get what you want as a first pick, and it involves other people having to pick you. And just because you pick them does not mean that they pick you. And I didn't get picked. I was like the kid in dodgeball that was the last man standing. And for a guy who has a lot of pride and had made it all the way through medical school, had been a company commander in the Army, like that, an immense amount of pride got thrown to the side. And I was pretty shell-shocked for a long time. I think I still even feel the effects to that to this day, that I feel like I failed. You know, you get through all of that and then you don't get picked. That was an extremely humbling situation. I understand better now that was not so much an act of failure as it was God closing a door that I wasn't supposed to walk through.
Yeah.
And when I look back at that situation now, I don't know what I was thinking trying to go into OBGYN.
Where did you end up?
In family medicine.
Okay.
I went into medical school wanting to go into family medicine. All of my mentors told me, you need to go into family medicine. I was the only one out there just bucking the trend, saying, "Oh yeah, well, I had this experience.
I've had a sign from God.
That's right.
I know,
and I wouldn't mess this up. I couldn't mess up God's. Of course not. But I got it completely wrong. I interpreted a few acts that happened in my life and let them determine something about my future that wasn't right.
Yeah. You had things that you felt very convinced of, that you felt like, man, God's really opening doors, and, transitioning over to medicine from being a military leader, going to poke holes in people, not plug holes in people. So you're going to make that transition. You felt like, okay, God did things that showed me this was the way. But then you had another big one where you thought that was another one of these signs from God, and it wasn't. How does a person tell the difference?
I think that the great thing is that God doesn't expect us to. When he wants us to go one direction, even if we're going the wrong direction, he closes the doors. And he reroutes us. And there are times in life where I don't think he really cares which direction we go. He cares which heart we do it with. Yeah. But he doesn't care which direction we go. And I think
you could please him whichever option you choose.
Absolutely.
It's not required to be one or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There are a lot of circumstances in life, who you choose to marry. I don't think God really, I don't think that God has one person out there just designed for you.
I agree.
I think that the way that you conduct yourself in your courtship and in your marriage is way more important than the person in which you do it with. Obviously, that's a personal opinion more than anything else.
But all the people out there that believe in one true love and a soulmate are all cringing at what we're saying here. But I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that there are areas in life where God doesn't dictate us directly. He tells us in which way we should do it, but he doesn't tell us what we should do specifically. And then there are areas in life where his will is going in one direction, and if we go the opposite, he will reroute us.
Yeah.
And I think that this was one of those examples where I was going the wrong direction, and he, in his mercy, rerouted me. And it didn't feel like a mercy at the time, but looking back, it's maybe the greatest act of mercy he's given me.
So you come back into the Army full-time as a physician who is specialized in family medicine. What has that led to?
Yeah. So
tell me what your life has been like.
Yeah. So, I mean, the fun thing is that right in the middle of, so after medical school, you go through residency. Mm-hmm. So residency is specialized training for whatever specialty you choose. So for family medicine for us, I went to an Army hospital that family medicine was the only residency program there, which means that we did everything. So we actually ran the OBGYN floor. And so I got to deliver babies just like I thought I was going to.
Yeah.
And I got to run the ICU. And then this little thing called COVID-19 hit.
Yeah.
And I ended up working a lot of hours doing a lot of things. And I think that's probably where my next failure kind of comes, is in watching patients in the ICU struggle with COVID and eventually die from it. And even now, like we could have done everything perfectly as a medical society, as a medical profession. We did everything we could, and it didn't change the outcome. And I think that that is a temptation, I think, that I struggle with, that it's like, if a patient dies, that is a failure. But I did everything that I could to prevent that, but it didn't matter. It still ended up as a failure. And I think that there's a lot of times that maybe our police officers end up in this situation that's kind of similar, where there's a really tragic situation that they didn't start, that they didn't continue, and they did everything they were supposed to do to try to mitigate it, but it still ended up ugly.
Yeah. They blame themselves for not driving to the call fast enough when that probably wouldn't have made a difference.
Yeah.
They blame themselves for not arresting the abuser the last time they were there. Whatever it is, I mean, they second guess themselves, and typically they have actually done everything they can do, but that doesn't stop the guessing game of, what if I had done something different, and is this my fault? And they really struggle with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the ironic thing is that you really want people that think like that, because those are the ones that care. Mm-hmm. Police officers, medical professionals, soldiers, the ones that don't care about the people that got hurt and died are the scary ones.
Yeah.
Are the ones that you're actually quite worried about,
yeah,
that are able to detach themselves emotionally. But it's also at the same time, it's not healthy for any of us to carry the burden of something that we can do nothing about. There's nothing more paralyzing than a situation in which you have no control and can do nothing to change the outcome, but you are still carrying that with you.
You are, as a doctor, you have had patients die, yes, in spite of your best efforts. How do you care enough to give them your best efforts, but then not carry that forever? Is there some way, some mindset, some approach, something you can do to be able to turn it on full blast and then turn it off again?
Golly. I will say that if there is, I don't know that I've figured it out. I still carry patients with me too much, I would say. I don't know that I have any great advice to give to somebody other than to say that you're not alone. That there are many, many, many of us that take that home with us and have to figure out how to deal with it. And the way that I deal with it is going to be so different than the way that others deal with it. I don't have a great piece of advice of how to compartmentalize. The people that care, they care. Yeah. And when you stop caring, usually that's a bad sign. Yeah. That's a sign of empathy fatigue.
But it's easy to become calloused and cynical and jaded.
Yeah. It's a survival mechanism.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that maybe as leaders, that's when we recognize and we kind of talk about in leadership that much like a piece of steel can be stretched. There's a point where you can put enough load on a piece of steel that it bends, but it doesn't break. But then there's a point where it starts to become deformed. Mm-hmm. And I think as leaders, we have to recognize when the people around us are past just being stretched and they are starting to get deformed to the point where, like, when that steel is bent to a certain degree, it can no longer ever go back to where it was before. And that's when I think we have to recognize that's different in different people. Different individuals can handle more or less stress.
Yeah.
And we can't apply this blanket application to everybody that says, all right, everybody gets this many times a day that they have to take a break, or this. Some people can handle an immense amount of stress and never show any fatigue.
Yeah.
And some people only can handle a little.
Yeah, I encourage people to, first of all, as leaders, to learn the people that you're supervising and be familiar enough with them that you truly know their baseline, so you can tell when they're deviating from their baseline.
Yeah.
Not everybody has the same temperament. Not everybody has the same amount of resiliency.
Yeah.
But if you can see where their baseline is, you can hopefully catch when they're going off track. And that's going to be one of the first red flags we see before, bad things start happening. So maybe we can, as a leader, intervene and say, hey, I'm going to make sure you have a mental health day off. I'm going to give you some sort of break. I'm going to put you on some other assignment. I'm going to find a way for you to get out of this rut so that you can recover. And not everyone needs that. And you can't know with certainty who needs it when, but the better you know your people, the more likely you'll make the right calls.
Yeah, no, I think that is spot on. As a leader, I have struggled with this mentality because you also get it wrong as a leader, where you think that this person is doing well and they're not. And it wasn't because of something that you did or didn't do. Sometimes the best leaders just miss the signs and you don't even interpret them till later. And one encouragement that I could give to leaders is that you got to get in the dirt with the people that you're in charge of. You can't get it perfect. You can know somebody so well and they will still do things.
They may be better at hiding it than you were at knowing them.
Absolutely. But your greatest chance of being able to intervene is knowing them, being dirty with them, getting that mud in your face at the same time as them, knowing what's going on at home, knowing what their background is. What did they grow up like?
You're going to have to be inquisitive, aren't you?
Yeah. And people don't like talking about this stuff either, especially to bosses. So you don't start there. I think that when you go through hard things together, you see more about the people around you. And, that's another encouragement to do hard training events as units, do things together as units. You will see aspects of people. Traditionally, we talk about this in the medical world, that the last area of your life that suffers is your work performance. Mm-hmm. Everything else in your life will fall apart and you will still be a rock star at work.
Yep.
But it's when your work performance falls off, that's a really, really late sign. There's definitely a professional line where, like, as a leader, you can't, be spending all your time with your subordinates, but, knowing their names and knowing where they are and
maintaining multiple points of contact.
It is, I think that's our greatest chance. And that, it's almost counter societal for us as Americans. We're so individual. Mm-hmm. We think we can do everything by ourselves, and we show the whole world the individual, the power of the individual. And I'm not taking that, individuals aren't capable of a lot, but individuals and groups can do more.
Yeah.
And I think that we were designed as humans to work together to complement each other. And if we can work together rather than apart, we'll take care of each other better.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for coming in. I appreciate you. And I really appreciate you sharing like this.
It's my pleasure. Now I need to figure out how to take some of the things that I say and put them into my own life.
Yeah. God bless you. Thank you. This second half of the conversation shows why I enjoy talking to Dr. Hachinsky, and it reflects pretty well the nature of our lunchtime conversations while he was at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. His words and wisdom show that he is equally capable of being both a warrior and a healer, a platoon leader and a physician. And God made him able to do both jobs, but at different times in his life. I don't know if law enforcement was the first chapter of your career or if it was the third. And there's almost certainly going to be something to do after law enforcement. But each chapter has its place, and it gives you wisdom for the next. Just remember to be humble and take care of your people. On the next episode of Hey Chaplain.
finding somebody that's culturally competent is important because it is a different field. We have unique jobs. And trying to find somebody that understands that, it can be difficult. I mean, trying to find a therapist that you connect with, number one, is difficult. Number two, that's culturally competent and knows what you're going through is even more difficult. I mean, there are people out there. I think we're lacking those people. And I think more first responders are actually retiring and being a therapist, like getting their degree and going to school and to be able to do that job to help other first responders, just because that they know there's a lack of culturally competent therapists out there.
This show is free for everyone because of those supporters who are quietly helping behind the scenes. If you want to help this show reach cops, chaplains, and other first responders around the world, please make a $5 donation by following the link in the episode description. The views expressed here are the personal views of the host and our guest and do not necessarily represent the views of any law enforcement agency or its components. Dr. Hachinsky barely even talked about medicine in this episode, but nevertheless, let me remind you that he is probably not your doctor. The information presented in this episode, including any statements or opinions expressed by Dr. Hachinsky, is for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment by a doctor who has actually met you. Always seek the advice of your qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition, and never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you heard on a podcast. Go see your doctor. If you like this episode, please share it with a cop or someone who loves a cop. Thank you for listening to Hey Chaplain, and as always, pray for peace in our city.